Right, Steve. How the hell did you get into music to begin with as a kid? How did you sort of discover your love of music?
Well, do you know what? I think it really happened when I joined a choir, because I used to live in Aylesbury, and there was this lovely church, St Mary's Church in Aylesbury, that had a proper choir going on. And I remember I was in the congregation with my mum at about age 10, and the choir master came up and said, "I can see you. You'd like to join the choir, wouldn't you?" And I ended up becoming like the head chorister, and it led me. And one of the members of the choir, his wife taught the piano, and one thing led to another, and I ended up, had a lovely, beautiful voice in those days that then disappeared when it cracked, but nonetheless, and then played the piano and all the rest of it. So I think that's how it all started. And then, of course, as I became more of a teenager, mid-teens, I started to. At that time, it was prog music, of course, and I joined a prog band with some local people. Actually, one of them was it turned out to be the first keyboard player in Marillion. His name is Brian Jellyman. Yes, he was in my first early band. We had a band, it was called Compound I, which I think is quite a cool name.
So you say you're really into the prog scene
at that point, yeah.
Yeah. So how old would you have been, and what sort of bands were you listening to that really inspired you?
Well, at that time, I mean, we're talking of when I was about 15, 16, I suppose. You know, then at that point it was really Yes and Pink Floyd, and in fact I've still got the Pink Floyd record that I had at that time. That's Dark Side of the Moon, and But gradually. Who else was it? Oh, all the stuff that was going on at that time. I'm trying to think, who was just so many bands. I can't even remember, but that kind of area of prog, And the Old Grey Whistle Test, was you had to watch the Old Grey Whistle Test every week. It was that kind of stuff, But gradually, my interest in music, and because I was learning music anyway, and my interest in music widened. And of course, I was singing kind of classical music, and I got into classical music in a big way as well. I remember discovering Radio 3 and on a little radio and listening to all this, and then gradually moving into the avant-garde. Started to, get into the kind of experimental music that was going on. So I remember, as I got older, wandering around London trying to find these odd records that nobody else knew about, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, it started in that prog way. But gradually moved. And in fact, early on, after the prog band, the next band I joined was a reggae band. And so then I got into Bob Marley and all that lot. And so that sort of suddenly opened my eyes to all sorts of other kind of stuff. And realising that there was a lot of music around, and all of it is interesting. So I would say now that it's quite interesting being part of a prog band because it's like, in a way, it's not necessarily where my musical taste now lies, But of course, I love Solstice. Of course, how can you not?
Exactly. Why keyboards?
That's a good question. I think it may have to do with the fact that as I was growing up, there was an old piano in the garden. That might be what caused it. But I think also I did start to. Funny enough, I learnt the mouth organ first because my father played the mouth organ, and then I remember going to school and for some reason took up the trombone. But none of these instruments. What I liked about the keyboards is that it's a complete instrument, and I think mainly, you see, I'm more of a creator of music. I'm a creative musician, not really just a player. And in fact, I know everybody thinks I'm pretty good at this, but I know that. If I compare myself with the guys that can really play, oh God, But in terms of actually creating music, and that's what I like about being part of Solstice, my role within Solstice is probably as creative as anyone other than, of course, Andy, who's the main creative force. But I have to kind of make up a lot of stuff, whereas I think most of the other band, I mean, obviously everybody has to do some creative work in order to make it work, and probably Pete does a lot of work too, creatively, but I'm often given a blank sheet to work from. So I have to kind of make up my parts and work out what on earth will work with what Andy gives me. And sometimes, of course, he doesn't like it. But usually I'll throw enough at him and he goes, I like this, we'll use that bit, you know. So that tends to be the way it goes. But, you know, essentially I'm a creative musician, really. You know, I compose and I make up music and I produce, and that's my big thing, you know. And the keyboard allows you to, it's got complete control, isn't it, you know.
Yeah. So tell me about how you ended up in Solstice. So what was the connection?
It's fantastic. Yeah. It's a fantastic story. So what happened? Okay. Well, this was back in the mid-90s, or early to mid-90s. And I was in a group of people that put together a sort of bluesy band. They were all friends of mine. Well, they were certainly, well, you know, one or two of them are still my friends. And we wanted to record some stuff. And I said, well, there's Madcap, which was in Wolverton, which at that time I had nothing to do with Madcap. It was before I was, you know, subsequently I became, you know, as you probably know, I started to get very much involved with Madcap, but it was long before then. And so we booked a session in there to record, and we were going to be recorded by someone who has subsequently become a very good friend of mine, who has, in fact, depped as the bass player for Solstice, a person called Guy Jones, who was early on, but he was sick at the point we went in. So the people who ran the little studio there called up Andy Glass as the next man in. So in came Andy, who's obviously a very, very, who's a total expert at recording. And I brought my Fender Rhodes, which is it's just behind you now. And I was playing this Fender Rhodes, and Andy looked round and he said, oh, a Fender Rhodes, and you can play it. Would you like to join a band? But it's interesting that I knew about Solstice because prior to that, I'd been in, years ago, back in the early 80s, when Solstice was getting started, I'd been in a band in the same, you know, physical area. Solstice was around Milton Keynes, but it was also around sort of Buckinghamshire, and I was in a local band from Aylesbury, and we often shared stages. We would often do certain gigs in Friars Aylesbury, and there is a photograph somewhere with Andy at one end of the stage and me at the other end of the stage, but we didn't know each other. And I also know that slightly before I joined in the first place, Andy and I used to meet at gigs and, oh, hello, we'll have a chat. You know, we became sort of some, you know, acquaintances. But it was that playing in Madcap on the Fender Rhodes and being dragged in, and suddenly my life changed. Suddenly the whole of everything changed. It was a fantastic moment, you know.
So it's like being in that circle of musicians.
Yes, being in that circle, and suddenly, like, I was in this band of people whose skills were so far and beyond of anything I'd ever experienced prior to that, and a challenge, you know, way above anything I'd ever done before.
So when can you put a date on roughly what, you know, which year did you?
Yeah, well, I do know. I think it was 95 actually, because it's around about 95. It might have been I'm sure it was about 95 that's actually happened, and So at that time, Clive Bunker, who was the drummer, a very well-known drummer amongst drummers, because he played in Jethro Tull. You know, he was the first drummer in Jethro Tull, was our drummer. And again, I mean, I'd never seen anything like it, you know. And then, of course, Robin, now the bass player, you know, still the bass player in Solstice, had been brought in. And what was fascinating about that was that his mum had been in Solstice in the first place. And Robin had known Solstice since he was 4. You know, so it was, and who else was? Of course, Emma was in it, and Emma was very young at the time, you know, and Jenny, of course, who's obviously subsequently actually, you know, has married Andy, and they've got loads of kids, you know. But at the time, Jenny was new, you know. So it was a whole new world, and spurned, in fact, it spurned the entirety of my laughingly called musical career. You know?
So talking of your musical career in Solstice, so what was the first memorable recording or gig that really stands out for you when you first?
Well, it was those early. After that period, 95 to about 98, we did a whole load of really interesting gigs, and because Clive Bunker, my understanding is that because Clive Bunker was a member of the band, what we did get onto was the Jethro Tull. What would you call them? Jethro. They were sort of Jethro Tull memorial gigs. You know, all these kind of conventions. That's right. They were Jethro Tull convention gigs where all players that had something to do with Jethro Tull, which of course included Fairport Convention. You see, they're very, very linked. You know, would perform. So I met all the. So we did all these gigs around Britain and in particular in Germany, fantastic things. And then ultimately Cropredy, that was the big one. We did Cropredy. I mean, I found myself on stage playing to 17,000 people. That was just off the scale, you know. Don't think I've ever managed to get anywhere near that bit again. But there was all these amazing old people that we met up with and got to know from that period, you know, from the Jethro Tull stroke Fairport Convention. Indeed, we got to know Fairport Convention quite well because we ended up getting on because they, you know, that they were the ones that ran Cropredy, and they'd invited us there to perform. So all of that period was very. It's just a fantastic time, yeah, fantastic time. I think Cropredy is the one I remember more than anything, but there were many others. It was brilliant, yeah.
And talk us through what was the album that you performed on at that time, recorded?
So I think Andy had just created Circles, but he created it without us. We didn't, without many of us. I think Emma was on it, yeah. But there were many of the previous musicians that had played on. Many of the previous musicians that had been in Solstice before, I think, were part of Solstice. But really, it was an Andy Glass. He'd sort of put it all together, and because he sort of wanted to get Solstice going again. You know, so Solstice had sort of stopped. You know, after the mid '80s, that I understand, and then he wanted to get it started again. And then it was on the back of Solstice that he put the new band together. You know, so. And that's what we were really playing more than anything else. There were a few other tracks, I think, from the past, but essentially that's what we were promoting at that time. So,
but you've been a permanent member of Solstice
well,
since
then,
95.
Well, what happened after about 98, I think it was. I might have my dates slightly wrong, but it was in that period. It just kind of fizzled out. Everything kind of came to a halt. It just fizzled out. And then in, I believe, 2006, now maybe somebody may come and say, no, it wasn't 2006, but I'm sure it was 2006, actually. I suddenly got the message from Andy, would we like to do Solstice again? so there's been this big gap, you know. And in that gap, Jenny and Andy had got married. There were children, I'm sure there was children by then. And so... and I had, you know, by which time I'd done a lot of other music, in particular with other members of the band, with Robin in particular and Emma. We were part of another, like it was called St Anthony's Child. It was a covers band that had got some, you know, that became quite renowned in the area, doing lots of weddings and things like that. But it was a proper job, you know. It's like you go out and do gigs and get paid a living wage. Goodness me, it was ridiculous. And so that had developed. I'd done lots and lots of gigs. I'd become much more sort of. But you will understand, it all came out of Solstice. You know, that's the way it started. And I'd become much more adept, I think, as a musician. You know, I'd done my dues, as it were, by then. And so when we And when we all got back together in 2006, I think everybody was a lot more, certainly, from what I could work out, many of us were better at what we were doing. It was in the early 2000, in the early Solstice, we were all a bit green. Some of us were a bit green, but by the time we joined again in 2006, everyone was an expert, because we'd trained and we'd really been out there and had to do it, so it was good.
What was the name of the first album that you felt you had a real creative input on then? Because obviously Circles, you said.
Yeah, Circles was before me.
Yeah.
Well, there was Spirit. I did a few bits and pieces on, because there was music that had been given to us, if you like, when we got back together again in 2006, that hadn't got onto an album yet. We developed it, and I was involved with the development. I guess I would have to work my keyboard parts out and do some stuff, and then gradually that. And then that found its way onto Spirit. So I think that was the first one I had a bit more input. And then following that, Prophecy, there was a lot more input, if you see what I mean.
Oh, when did Prophecy?
And Prophecy came out. When did Prophecy come out? I think that was that 2000? Oh God, was that 2010? I can't remember, I'm afraid. I think it was 2010, something like that kind of time. I may not have the dates quite right, sorry. It's all a blur. But that kind of period, I guess, was when it was. And I know that at that point, what was happening, Andy would come round, as Prophecy was being created, Andy would actually come round to this very room once a week in the evenings. And we would work out parts, and develop them. And then he'd take them away and edit them into what he was actually producing. And that was the first time we really went for it. I think that one I was very much involved in what was on it. But Andy is very much he runs it. He's the best musical director I've ever experienced in my life at anywhere. Amazing. What a man to work for and with, because he is totally in charge. He knows what he wants to have happen, but he is never. He encourages us at every move. He's never anything other than, positive. It's just brilliant. I don't know what he's thinking in his head sometimes, but, but he always brings the best out of us. He's a person to. So he's definitely the musical director, 100%. But he'll take on board the creative inputs that we're giving, which is wonderful. So it's a great thing to be doing.